Welcome to the Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Gary Bakke. Today we have the privilege of visiting with Russ Feingold, my guest. Welcome.
Good morning.
What brings you to Western Wisconsin today?
Well, I've been on a tour of all 72 counties last year in 2015, and this year in 2016 we continue to listen to people. I've had a chance to visit a couple of fantastic businesses here in this area in the past, in Hudson, and trying to see the innovation in businesses all across the state. What I'm trying to do, as I challenge for this U.S. Senate seat, is make sure that I know more about what's going on in the state than anybody. You know, in other words, study, listen, make sure that as of January, if I'm lucky enough to be elected, that I actually know what's going on the ground and know what people are thinking. And then that's very different from the approach my opponent is taking. So I think that's what the people of the state need when they elect somebody who's going to represent them in the United States Senate.
If you'll permit me, I'd like to ask you some questions that aren't typical campaign questions. More questions about actually being a senator as opposed to being elected senator, if you can bear with me. Obviously, one of the big issues that the next Senate is going to have is confirming a Supreme Court justice. What are the criteria? And by that, I think historically the president, obviously still the president nominates, and the Senate confirmed if the person was qualified. That has morphed a little bit into the Senate making their own political judgments. Tell me how you make those decisions.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, let me say that my principal goal here in running for the U.S. Senate is to make sure that I am responding to what the people of Wisconsin want. And what they have told me in all 72 counties is that middle income and working families can't make ends meet, that they can't pay the bills. And so that's going to be my primary focus. But you brought up something that is also important to people, because the people of this state get to elect the president every 4 years. And as you know, as a lawyer, under the Constitution, it's very clear what happens when something like the death of Justice Scalia occurs, which is that the will of the people is supposed to be reflected through the President of the United States, and that the United States Senate is supposed to make a judgment. It's called the advising consent power. The President shall nominate. It's not gets to if he feels like it. He shall nominate. And the Senate shall advise and consent. So what's happened here? What's happened here, unfortunately, is that the criteria and the constitutional requirement has been completely disregarded. Justice Scalia passed away, and we have now had an appointment of Judge Garland. We have now passed the all-time record of the longest time ever in American history when a vote hasn't been taken on a Supreme Court justice. The longest before was an incredibly famous justice when he finally got on. Took 125 days to vote on Louis Brandeis in the early 19th century, and he, of course, became one of the legendary justices. This is sad because this is very threatening to our Constitution. So the number one criterion, the number one issue here is, will the Senate do its job? And unfortunately, Senator Johnson, who I'm running against, the incumbent, person that holds this job, refuses to do his job. He says, we should let the people decide. But as you and I know, under the Constitution, the people already decided. They didn't elect Barack Obama to a 3-year term. They elected him to a 4-year term. And it's outrageously disrespectful to the President and the Constitution to not act. So now, and unfortunately, Senator Johnson said, well, of course, it might have been a little different if Mitt Romney had won the election. So what you're saying is absolutely right. They've turned it into a political circus. Now, when I was in the United States Senate, I had the opportunity to vote on some justices, and actually, on 2 occasions, it was under George Bush. I wasn't for George Bush. I didn't support him. I actually thought maybe he didn't really win the election. But when he had 2 vacancies, I never doubted his right to fill the seat, and I acted accordingly. So in answer to your question, I did my job. I had the privilege of meeting with both Alito and Judge Roberts in my office for an hour each when they were up. Got to talk to them personally, ask them about their favorite baseball teams, and, that sort of thing, and then also about their feelings about the issues. I then attended 4 or 5 days of long days on the Judiciary Committee of listening to the judges who were being appointed and got to ask questions, extensive questions myself. And then I went ahead and evaluated what they had said and how I felt about it. And unlike Senator Johnson, I made a judgment. And in one case I voted for the nominee, and one case I voted no. So if you're asking what the criteria are, in my view, Judge Roberts, even though he's very conservative and in my view was a guy that I have not liked some of his rulings, he seemed very capable. He seemed like somebody who would care about the future of the Supreme Court, and actually showed when it came to the Affordable Care Act that he would do what was right for the country and the law rather than doing something purely political. So I voted for him. I voted against Judge Alito. Now, what was that about? He appeared to be somebody who had already had his mind made up. He's an ideologue, not a judge. You know, my father, Leon Feingold, was a wonderful lawyer for 46 years in Janesville. He knew all the lawyers around the state. He would have known all the guys that you practiced law with. What he cared about more than anything was that judges were open-minded and fair. I thought Judge Alito was locked in on the corporate side, and that's proven to be true. So I voted no. But the point is that I did my job. Senator Johnson has literally refused to take his constitutional responsibility, and it just said, I'm not doing it for political reasons.
I think we were temporarily interrupted here, but the question was about ideology as a Supreme Court nominee. And what's your view of that?
Well, you know, you look at somebody who's appointed, you do have to make sure they can do the job. In other words, do they have the legal ability? Do they have the intellect to do it? Secondly, make sure there's no ethical problems. You know, if they've got any, skeletons in the closet and so on, believe me, those come out these days. That's important. But then after that, my view is I don't believe in litmus tests. In other words, I don't think either right-wingers or left-wingers or others should be able to say, well, because they take this position on this issue, I can't vote for them. I don't believe in that. But if it does seem that they have a worldview or an ideology that will prevent them from looking at the case before them, apply the law to the facts, if they can't do that, then I think it disqualifies them. And so that's important because, frankly, people on both sides, political people, want senators to vote on single issues. And I think that's wrong. And I think that is dangerous for one of the most important institutions in our country, the United States Supreme Court. So again, this goes back to the fundamental belief I have about what it is to be a senator. You have to reflect the will of the people. And you can only reflect the will of the people if you go out and listen to them. And you can only reflect the will of the people if when you act, you do what the Constitution requires. Because the Constitution was ratified by the people. And so I think this is one of the worst things I've ever seen the United States Senate do. It is very threatening because what are Democrats going to do if the same thing happens the other way? You're going to end up with 2 justices. That's not going to work.
Let me switch topics on you for a minute. Undeclared wars. What, as a senator, what influence do you have on where we send our military and how we fund our military? It's been a long time since we've been in a declared war in the constitutional sense, but we seem to be out in the world anyway.
Well,
tell me about your role as senator in that regard.
Well, whoever would be in the Senate should know or learn that in the Constitution, the power to declare war under Article 1 is given to the Congress, not to the President. Sadly, as you well know, in the last 100 years, we've gotten really far away from that. The last time a war was declared was World War II in December of 1941. As I've studied this, looked at it throughout my life, as a person that was very concerned, for example, as a student about the war in Vietnam and other undeclared wars, I began to realize that Congress was just not doing its job. And the same thing is happening right now. Instead of taking the tough vote, people like Senator Johnson are saying, well, I'll just blame the president for what's going on with ISIS instead of giving the president a declaration or the authority to move forward, that he has no authorization. And what happens is a senator like Senator Johnson gets to have it both ways. In other words, if things go well with the military action, he can go and greet the troops and praise it. If it doesn't go well, he can say, well, I didn't vote for it, because he didn't have to vote for it. That's not what the founders of this country intended. And so the failure to do this job with regard to ISIS, the failure to give the president more authority so he can get tough with this disgusting organization is, again, a failure to do the job of a senator. And we have gotten into interventions over the years, mistaken ones, or stayed in too long, like Vietnam and others, because the Congress hasn't stepped up to the plate when it should. And I feel strongly that it is a job of a senator to question these wars. Senator Johnson has called for 100,000 troops to be sent into Syria and Iraq without any plan to what we do the next day. And a couple of weeks ago he said, and it should be a generational thing. Well, I can tell you the American people, and especially the people of Wisconsin, don't have anything to do with that. It's a stupid idea because it's exactly what ISIS wants. Well, that's when Congress should step up. That's when the Senate and the House should say, no. They should pass a resolution saying that this is not permitted, instead of letting the president do this in a situation where I know President Obama won't do it, but unfortunately, I fear that's the kind of thing Donald Trump might do. And of course, Ron Johnson supports Donald Trump. So together, I don't see there's any real chance that they're going to respect the role of the Senate and the role of the Congress in helping to decide when we go to war.
I think I recall that Donald Trump has said, what's the use of having nuclear weapons if we don't use them? How can the Senate control that?
Well, again, it's by using its authority to restrict that kind of power. The president does not have unilateral power to go ahead and use that kind of nuclear force unless he's been given the authority under the Constitution. But if people just stand back and let the president do whatever he wants, you could have somebody like Trump believing that he can do that. That's because we've gotten away from what the founders of our country wanted. You know, they had had the king. They had had enough of that. They wanted checks and balance. That's what the whole thing's about. And yet, for political convenience, people like Senator Johnson say, well, I'll just blame Obama. That works really well. He's not responsible. Even though he's chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, he won't lift a finger to give the president the authority to go after ISIS.
Again, let me change topics here a little bit and get to something that's a little closer to the actual campaign. Minimum wage. Tell me about what you think we ought to be doing with the minimum wage.
Well, I think the idea of a federal minimum wage is a very solid and important thing to protect people. And when I was in the state Senate here in Wisconsin, we had a good system. They had a commission where they had management and labor get together, propose increases over time, and then the Senate and the Assembly would approve it. So they basically took it out of politics. And it worked really well, because by the time it got to the state legislature and the governor, people were like, okay, this is what they've come up with. So it was able to keep pace with reality. That's the opposite of what's happened in Congress and in the national level. It's gotten stuck for political reasons. It's stuck at only $7.25, which is ridiculously low. That's not a living wage, not even close to being a living wage. And I strongly believe it needs to be substantially increased. Senator Johnson actually has said he doesn't believe there should even be a federal minimum wage, and voted against even raising it from $7.25. And why is that? It's because he doesn't get around the state. He goes on Fox News, he stays out in Washington, but he doesn't do what I would have done in the past during this campaign and would do in the future. Is if you get around the state, the leading thing people say is that they're having a hard time paying the bills. And the first thing they mention is that minimum wage is so low, because we all know that raising the minimum wage doesn't just help the person at the minimum wage level, it manages to help push up wages across the board. And so some people say, well, you know, this is going to be a problem for businesses. A lot of businesses favor raising the minimum wage, at least to $12. And one of the reasons is, if you go down to downtown Hudson, which I've done several times in this campaign, popped into the nice shops down there, it's a beautiful Main Street. I popped into the Chamber of Commerce a couple of times, surprised them, scared them a little bit the first time. But you know what people need in those businesses? Customers. They need people to walk in there and buy the good baked goods that are down there and the candy and the cool things that are in the shops. People stop doing that when they run out of a little bit of extra money. And even though sometimes it's a challenge to keep pace with wages for employers, the sure thing that's going to kill a business like that is that people don't have any extra money. And so I think it's consistent with stimulating the economy and a pro-business thing to have an increase in the minimum wage. It's shocking that Senator Johnson is so out of touch with the people of Wisconsin, so oriented toward the corporations and the billionaires and the multimillionaires, that he won't even support the idea of a federal minimum wage. He won't support 1 penny more of minimum wage. I mean, that's completely out of touch.
I think almost 50 years ago, I think the year was 1968, the minimum wage in today's dollars was almost 50% higher than it is today.
That's a good way to look at it.
Is there any support for indexing minimum wage like we index Social Security payments? Is there anybody talking about that?
Well, that's exactly what I was sort of getting at earlier when I was talking about how it works in Wisconsin, or used to at least was one of the systems in Wisconsin, is if you have some kind of indexing, which doesn't mean you couldn't raise it more, but at least it keeps pace with inflation. That's a lot better system, and I certainly would support, in addition to some kind of a significant increase, I would support some kind of indexing so you don't have, what happens now without the indexing is it becomes a political football. It's like Republicans versus Democrats, and this shouldn't be political. This should be based on sort of the economy, on the cost of living, on the needs of the business community, and unfortunately, it's just a political football now. So indexing would help.
You know, the federal government has statistics about the poverty level and what is poverty in this country. And I think for a family of 2, you don't get out of poverty if you work full-time at minimum wage.
That's correct. I was just looking at those figures the other day.
And is there any indication that we might index it to what we call poverty?
Well, that would be a start. I mean, can you imagine that your incumbent United States Senator won't even raise the minimum wage to the poverty level? I mean, that's what we're at right now. I think it should be a living wage. I don't think it necessarily has to be just to the poverty level, but that would be better. We're not even there right now, as you say, for a family of 2 or a family of 4. It's only if somebody is single and they're the only person in their family, that's the only time when it's just barely above the minimum wage. So that's a great sign of how, as you pointed out, it's not what was intended. The minimum wage was supposed to be stronger than just putting you just below the poverty level.
I've never understood exactly what the income definition is for poverty, but if you work full-time and pay Social Security tax, you may not get to the poverty level as an individual. I know if you don't take out the tax, you do.
No, I mean, everybody knows that these prices are, and it's not just sort of the day-to-day reality that would be in that formula. What about if your son or daughter is going to college and student loans? I mean, that isn't in there, in that calculation. Yeah. That can be devastating. What about if a grandma has huge prescription costs, drug costs? So you're a family, you see your mother, your father, elderly, trying to get their prescription drugs, and you find out, or medicines, and you find out the grandma has cut that pill in half because she's afraid she can't afford it and has to pay her food and rent. Well, that's a strain on that family. And so these are all parts of the reality that make it completely unacceptable to leave the minimum wage where it is, and where Senator Johnson is so out of touch that he would vote with the special interest in the corporations instead of making sure that the working families of the state get a fair deal on their hard work. We're talking about people that are working here, by definition. These are people that are working. They're working hard, and they're not getting paid fair.
Let's just raise the income level in our discussion a little bit to what we call the middle class. Everybody is convinced that the middle class is shrinking. And it's shrinking sometimes in favor of businesses or business owners. My question is, how can businesses survive in the long term without a strong middle class to buy their products?
That's a big part of the problem. When I was getting at not only in the minimum wage, but just in general, when people don't have that disposable income and are just on the edge of paying those bills, or what I'm hearing is not able to pay the bills, this is a serious problem. And when you have people in the Senate that make their tax bill higher by voting for special breaks for corporations, that means you and I pay more taxes. So people like Senator Johnson support $50 billion over 10 years for the oil and gas companies to get preferential treatment that was based on the conditions basically 100 years ago. You've got corporate jets getting treated like crop dusters instead of being treated like commercial jets. That's $3 billion. There is a provision in the code that allows these Wall Street traders to get carried interest deduction, as if what they're doing there is a capital gains deal. It's not. It's just regular income, but they have a special deal that they bought through all these campaign contributions. That's $16 billion. I have proposed a plan, the Federal Fiscal Fitness Plan, that has up to $1 trillion in ideas about how we could close some of those loopholes to lower the tax load for those middle-class families. So yes, it has to do with making sure they get fair wages. It has to make sure that we do something that they're not hammered by student loans and prescription drug costs. But it also has to do with this issue of making sure that our tax code is a tax code that respects the fact that a public official should be a steward, a good steward of the public's tax dollars, because we don't voluntarily pay these taxes. We do it because we have to. And so that's a special responsibility. And frankly, Senator Johnson hasn't found a corporate tax loophole he doesn't like.
Social Security. The health of Social Security is debated. Senator Johnson has called it a Ponzi scheme. Comment on that, would you please?
Yeah, I mean, this is really scary for seniors. Again, I go to all the counties, listen to people, and I also had special roundtables all across the state, Green Bay, Wausau, down in La Crosse, with seniors. And they are very nervous about this talk about privatizing Social Security. It was attempted by George Bush. I've always believed that Social Security should continue as a public program. And in fact, I always point out this was a Wisconsin idea. As you and I both know, it was invented on Bascom Hill in Madison on the campus, and then the Roosevelt administration started the process. So when Senator Johnson calls it a Ponzi scheme, first of all, people gasp because it scares them. And that's not what a Ponzi scheme is, because a Ponzi scheme is a deal where people, the investors up front, they all get paid, and everybody that paid in later didn't get anything. I always ask the crowd, any of you getting your Social Security checks? And they always say, yeah, we're getting them. Well, it's been paying out for 70 years. So this is a way to scare people, to create a scenario where this gets turned over to Wall Street. And that's exactly what Senator Johnson supports. He said a few months ago that, quote, it is a shame, that's a quote, that the Bush plan for private accounts didn't go through. And we all know that was proposed in the years just before the collapse on Wall Street. And so that means people's accounts would have gone away. And what does this mean? For many seniors in this state, that's all they have. That's it. For a lot of other families or individuals, it's that and maybe some kind of a modest pension. And they're not complaining. They're just saying, wait a minute, cost of living increase didn't come in. These guys are talking about turning this out, that they have to manage some kind of a private account. If this system went into place, future seniors would have to do that. And I find that to be, again, completely out of touch with the people of the state. Overwhelmingly, the people of the state believe it is not a Ponzi scheme, and they don't want it privatized. So this is a sharp difference between me and Senator Johnson. I've been endorsed by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, because when I was in the Senate, I had a 100% record in favor of preserving these programs. Senator Johnson has a 0% record, which is hard to achieve, to have absolutely no votes that are in favor of it. So once again, here's the pattern. I go around the state and listen to people tell me what their concerns are, and they're very concerned about this. Senator Johnson does not do that. He does what the big corporations and the multimillionaires and the billionaires tell him to do, and on this issue, he goes along with the Koch brothers and with the idea of privatizing Social Security, which is, frankly, one of the worst ideas I've ever heard.
Well, many of us who had 401ks know what happens to privatized retirement funds during the crash.
Yeah, one guy recently said after the crash, he called it his 201k.
Well, mine wasn't quite that bad, but it did bring to mind what would happen if we were privatized.
There it is.
And so I thought the privatizing thing might have died back with the crash.
Well, I think for most people it has died, but not for Senator Johnson. He still thinks it's the greatest idea since sliced bread. So I think we need to make sure that, look, this scares older people. It scares younger people who are hoping to have their Social Security. The idea is to provide security, not make people feel insecure. So I want to convey to people that if I'm elected senator, they're going to have a strong supporter of Social Security.
Switching gears again, climate change. People talk about whether you believe in climate change as if it's an ideological belief as opposed to a scientific fact. First, is it an ideological belief or is it a scientific fact?
Well, you know, science wasn't my favorite subject. I liked it, but I believe in it. I think it's really important. And I always have such respect for those that are scientists, and scientists tell us a very clear thing. Of course the climate has changed, and man-made activity has had a lot to do with it. Anybody that's fair-minded and is honest would admit that. And look, you and I grew up in this state. You and I know the climate's changed, right? It's different than when we used to walk as 5-year-olds to school. The snowstorms, the heat, all that. We always had to change the seasons, but it's so much more erratic now. It's violently changed just in our lifetimes, which is an amazing and disturbing thing. So I believe, of course, that this is real, and I believe that we need to work on a bipartisan basis to make sure this doesn't make the future of our children and grandchildren miserable. I mean, think about our children and grandchildren having to suffer from extreme heat and droughts. I mean, it could be absolutely devastating to those we love, and it could be the worst legacy that anybody has ever left. So we need to do something about it. Again, the difference between me and Senator Johnson is just dramatic. He's a climate change denier. I mean, he admits that there's some changes in the climate, but he says that it was because of sunspots, which I don't think is what the scientists say. He also said recently that there hasn't been any warming in the last few years. Well, it was just reported a couple months ago that July of 2016 was the hottest month since they were able to keep records in human history, since they've been able to keep records. So he's literally, instead of admitting that there's a problem, saying nothing we can do about it, and all I can think of is my grandson. He's 5 years old. The idea that he would suffer in a climate that was unspeakably hot or difficult is one of the most painful things I can think about. So we have to act on it. It was bipartisan a few years ago. I remember Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi sitting on a couch together doing an ad about climate change until the Tea Party people came in and turned it into a toxic subject. My goal is in January, if I'm lucky enough to be elected, to go back to those senators, like Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, Republican, who is willing to work on this issue. I want to go back to them and say, can we get this to be an issue beyond politics, please, and work for the future? And by the way, there was a really wonderful moment on this recently that's hopeful. This isn't something that all the industries are against action on. Some of them are really for it. The Obama administration negotiated an agreement with the heavy truck industry. They came to them and said, we want to get away from some of this emission problems. And they agreed to significant changes for the future on the heavy trucks, which, by the way, is something like 25% of the auto-related emissions. They decided they could sell trucks better if they did this, that it would make overall less expensive overall for a truck owner to do this. And so this is a great achievement that, unfortunately, Senator Johnson, if he's reelected, he would never work on this because he doesn't believe it's real. And I think you deserve a senator in the tradition of Gaylord Nelson from this part of the state, the man from Clear Lake. He founded Earth Day, and he would be appalled that a senator that holds his seat in the United States Senate doesn't even admit the science of climate change. We talked there before we started about Warren Knowles and Republicans, also from this part of the state. They believed in the environment. They believed in conservation. And they would never have been climate deniers, climate change deniers.
It's going to take a bipartisan approach to make any headway at all. You have a signature bill that the Supreme Court has devastated, but the McCain-Feingold legislation proves that you have the ability, or at least had historically the ability, to work cross-party lines. Is that still there? Is that still possible in this climate?
I believe that's the natural way that people in our state and also people in office want to be, that they actually would prefer to be bipartisan. What happened in 2010 and some of the years after that was that some political figures became scared that if they worked with the other side, particularly on the Republican side, they'd get a primary and be knocked out. And that happened to some people, Senator Lugar, Senator Bennett. But I think the natural state that certainly the people of the state prefer is that people work together. They understand Republican, Democrat during an election, but they want us to get down to work in January and to stop this stuff. So not only is that what my time in the Senate was about, there were many other bills about health care with Senator Collins and others, but that's what my life has been a lesson about. My father, growing up in Janesville, my family will have been in this state for 100 years next year. He was on the Rotary Club in Janesville. There were only 2 Democrats out of 132, and they finally let him be president of the Rotary Club. And one of my dad's best friends was a Republican. He'd get up there and he'd say, "Sit down, you darn Democrat." You know, it was good-natured. He ended up being one of my father's pallbearers. It wasn't war. And so that's the lesson I learned. And then I learned it again when I first ran for the state Senate. Started knocking on doors. I was this young guy, I'd never done this before, and I noticed that if you started saying Democrat or Republican, the door would start closing. I said, we don't want to hear about that. We want to hear about your ideas. We want to see people work together. And I have one of the strongest records ever in the United States Senate for bipartisan work. Senator Johnson, unfortunately, is extremely partisan. He never misses a chance to take a shot at the president in terms of his positions or blaming him for things. When North Korea, Kim Jong-un does one of these nuclear tests, which the North Koreans have done no matter who the president is, somehow it's all Barack Obama's fault. I don't think that's the way we should work together in government. We should try to respect the president when we can. As I pointed out, not only when it came to Supreme Court appointments, but even George Bush, when I could not have disagreed with him more about the Iraq War and a number of other things, when he did something right, I praised him. Like he did the HIV/AIDS program for Africa, which was an historic, humane thing that America did. And it was a great achievement of President Bush. President Bush tried to get comprehensive immigration reform, and I praised him for that. Senator Johnson won't touch it. So Wisconsin deserves a senator who's willing to work on a bipartisan basis on immigration reform, climate change, picking Supreme Court appointments, making improvements in the health care system, campaign finance reform, you name it. On all those issues I just mentioned, Senator Johnson will never be bipartisan, and you can be sure that I would be.
I understand from the outside looking in that you have a genuine affinity for some Republicans, McCain being one of them.
I like a lot of Republicans. I like Democrats. And I judge them on the merits. If somebody is honest and willing to work together, there's nothing more fun than finding sort of a conservative where you actually come together on something. Because then you know you're probably right. You know?
I understand that some people wouldn't even have coffee with a member of the opposition.
Well, when McCain and I were working on this thing with campaign finance, so many people were mad at us on both sides. And you're supposed to have lunch with your same caucus on Tuesdays with your fellow. John and I started talking about just having lunch together because people were mad that we were trying to take away their big campaign contributions. But yeah, I mean, look, I think most people that go to the Senate don't go there with an attitude of disliking people in the other party. But there has been a lot of that from some of this Tea Party crowd that Senator Johnson's part of. That group has helped create a very negative atmosphere in the Senate. But I think we can change it, and I think we're going to be able to change it in January.
Well, we need bipartisanship.
We certainly do.
We need a senator that will be bipartisan because you're never going to be 100% of the Senate.
That is for sure.
Another topic in the campaign has been student loans and the effect that that has dragging down the economy generally because the huge student loans that a lot of college graduates now have and limits their ability to buy houses, et cetera. What's your position on that?
I feel very strongly about this, and you know, when I say that I've been to all the counties and I didn't set the topic for people, I didn't come into the diner and see the guys having coffee together and say, "You talk to me about this," so what's on your mind? When you hear people talk about middle income and working families and their costs, you know, a lot of it's about the wages and the day-to-day expenses, but the biggest single thing we hear is, what about this student loan crisis? You know, we're both Badgers. when we went to college, when Senator Johnson went to college, the cost of tuition was very different. You know, he went to University of Minnesota. I went to Wisconsin.
I went to Wisconsin.
I know. I said you're a Badger. I know you're a Badger. But whether you're a Gopher or a Badger, it was about the same. So back in our time, when we were in college, I would say it was, you know, much less. In fact, Senator Johnson has said, well, he worked his way through college to pay for the tuition. Well, that's great. It was $600. Now,
I think mine was $165 a semester.
well, that's possible. I don't know.
I'm older than you guys.
Exactly. I thought I'm not gonna suggest why that might be, but
But it was possible to work to earn your tuition.
yeah. So like, you know, 71, 70. When I went to college in 1971, that's what it was. So Senator Johnson says, well, he paid for it himself. You know, that's good, but it was only $600. Now, if you can imagine this, because we both went to Madison, it's $11,000 a year for just in-state tuition. It's $25,000 for the full boat, so it's $100,000 for a degree. The whole idea was that it would be affordable for Wisconsin citizens and the people that pay taxes here. The average debt coming out of Madison for those that have debt is $28,000. And the problem with this is not only is it frightening for the students and the families, and they have to start off life this way, it's bad for the economy. It's bad for jobs. I was talking to a realtor recently, one of the top realtors in the state, and you know, he told me about his support for the mortgage interest deduction, which I agreed with, his support for the deductibility of state and local taxes, which I agree with. But the third thing he said you wouldn't necessarily think would be a realtor's comment. He said, we're worried about student loans. Thought about it for half a second, I realized what he meant. Young couple here in Hudson, they come out of college or technical college, and they both have good jobs. And they want to buy a house, but they can't because it's $75,000 in debt. That means they can't get the house. That means the realtor can't get his commission. That means the construction worker can't build the house. That means the painter can't paint the house. That means the man or woman making the window over in Ladysmith, Wisconsin, can't put the window in the house. So it affects all of us.
We understand that, but there's two aspects of it. One is going forward, how do we stop that trend? And the other is, what do we do about the people that already have the burden of a student loan?
Let me start with the first one, or the second one. So for those that already have a student loan, there is a very important piece of legislation led by Elizabeth Warren, which would allow you, if you have a student loan, to renegotiate the interest rate just like you can on a mortgage. The general view is it would be maybe go from 8% to 3%, very significant difference. I would support that law. Senator Johnson votes against it. He won't even lift a finger to fix that. We also have to make the system better by making sure that the federal government can't take any profits, and there are profits that come off of these interest rates, and use it for other things. I think we should pass a law in the United States that says that money should be poured back into the student loans. And so what you have here is somebody who's willing to take this action. In fact, I would like to see us work toward an effort of families, students, the universities looking at their expenses, the state government, the federal government having a partnership to try to see if people could at least come out of college with no debt with regard to tuition. I think that would be a very modest and reasonable goal. Now, Senator Johnson says that the students consider this free money. Like they don't understand that you have to pay interest. Actually, they do. They're smart kids. They've gotten into good colleges here, and they know that this is bad. So, you know, to me, these are things we can do. All the things I just mentioned are specific. Senator Johnson has specifically said he doesn't believe that there should have ever been a federal student loan program, which means you have to figure out how to get born into a rich family. So again, when people vote on November 8th, they have to decide, do you want to elect a senator who's going to do something now about this, or somebody who's going to just say, well, this is a bad system, too bad, tough luck if you're stuck with a high interest rate, tough luck if you have to start off life with, frankly, a frightening level of student loans.
I'd love to continue this conversation for the rest of the day. I enjoy it, and I'd like to hear more about your ideas. But I think our time is up. I want to thank you for taking the time to visit with us today. It's been interesting and important. This is a critical time for democracy, and we need to hear from you about your ideas.
Thank you. We covered a lot of ground.
And thank you for watching Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Gary Bakke. Thank you.